Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We are joined today by Ambassador Jack Matlock. Welcome back to the program, sir.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
So, Ambassador, you had a very key role in the US-Soviet diplomacy during the most critical phases of the Cold War towards the ending, as both you and President Reagan were then pushing and negotiating an end to the Cold War. And I wanted to ask some questions about how this peace was achieved, but also, I guess, how we lost it. I thought a good place to start would be, to ask, um, what did you make at the time of Gorbachev's ideas of ending the bloc politics and replacing it with this common European home? Was there, in terms of the suspicion, was there belief that this was not genuine, or how was this received on the American side?
Well, it was received as legitimate by our presidents at the time. That is, President Reagan and the first President Bush. Not all of our people in the government thought so, and certainly the senior people in the CIA were dubious. But I think our presidents thought that this was sincere at the time because he was changing other policies to make it credible. Also, it seemed to be almost the same as President Bush's aspect for a Europe whole and free. I think also this was Prime Minister Thatcher's picture from the UK. So I think it was welcomed. Europe as a common European home, and that was combined with Gorbachev's rejection, implicit but clear rejection of Marxist-Leninist basis of the Soviet foreign policy up until then. And he expressed this in a speech at the United Nations in December of 1980. So that I think that that was absolutely accepted at the time. I would also point out that in their meeting in Malta in December 1989, President Bush and Gorbachev made a formal agreement. Number one, that they agreed that the Cold War was over. Second, Gorbachev pledged not to interfere with political changes in Eastern Europe, in other words, the democratization. And President Bush pledged not to take advantage of political changes there. Now, subsequently, of course, expanding NATO into what had been the Warsaw Pact was a total violation of that understanding, entirely aside from other assurances that were given later during the negotiations over German unification in 1991.
Often we have these competing dates for when the Cold War ended. Again, as you suggested, in Malta in December of '89, the Cold War was declared to be over. However, 2 years later, in December of 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was later argued that no, this was the real end of the Cold War. So why do these competing narratives matter, whether it was in 1989 or 1991?
It makes a lot of difference because the Cold War had ended at least 2 to 3 years before the Soviet Union collapsed. That's number one. Second, it was not the policy of the United States to break up the Soviet Union. We wanted the 3 Baltic states to regain their independence. We had never recognized them as legally part of the Soviet Union, but we recognized the other 12 republics as part of the Soviet Union, and we actually did not want them to break up. When we saw that Gorbachev was democratizing the country, then we we saw that that was the way they ought to go. And President Bush, when he went to Kiev, and after his summit with Gorbachev in Moscow, he spoke to the Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada, and stated, advised them to adhere to Gorbachev's Union Treaty and warned them against what he called suicidal nationalism. At that point, what he had in mind was what was happening in Georgia, which was almost an internal war against minorities in Georgia, so that actually we would have welcomed a preservation of the 12 republics as a more democratic federation and a voluntary federation. We didn't want to see the breakup. Now, of course, many people at the time didn't see that. It was called by one of our prominent commentators his Chicken Kiev speech, as if it was a cowardly one. These people didn't understand the Cold War was over, and that although the Soviet Union was trying to reform its economy, that was a very difficult thing to do. Another thing that people misunderstand when they speak of Russia always aggressive or imperialistic, it was the elected leader of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, who led the breakup of the Soviet Union. This was something that happened internally, despite the desire of those of us in the West to see that a democratic union would be better for all concerned than breaking it up and going to, you might say, extreme nationalism.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the Kiev chicken speech because he didn't take a more hardline approach against the Russians. But again, in those days, it was recognized that it would be dangerous to fuel to nationalist forces. But if we forward to today, we see people like Boris Johnson welcoming Azov Battalion in the British Parliament and other fascist groups within Ukraine, which is, again, I wouldn't put this in the same categories even as the nationalist. There's many Ukrainian nationalists who have nothing to do with any fascist groups. But how or why did it become? Did we end up at this point where we go and support not just nationalists but quite radical nationalists?
Well, I'm not sure I understood your question. Why? What?
Why did Washington, as well as its European partners, move away from this effort to not fuel the nationalist forces and indeed do the exact opposite?
I think in the Clinton administration, the one that followed the first Bush administration, we started, first of all, without expanding NATO, but trying to organize a partnership for peace, which all of the East Europeans and the former states of the Soviet Union could be part of, and which was approved by the Russian President Yeltsin. We switched and began to talk about expanding NATO to the east. Now that it was not only the matter that violated previous understandings which are not written in treaties but were clearly understood. But the problem was that once you start expanding NATO when there was no threat against any of the NATO countries, you turn it from a defensive alliance to an offensive alliance. And although later Russia did not oppose the initial expansion that to to Czechia, Hungary, and Poland, and later, then President, then Russia did not actually oppose extension to the Baltic states, but this was all under the condition that there be no foreign bases in these countries. In other words, it was not so much the Title V guarantee that Russia objected to, but the placement of foreign, particularly American bases in these countries. They would naturally consider these aimed at them, and so at the time when they were no threat whatsoever, their military was in complete disarray. So that started that process. Now you say, why? I think in terms of the United States, it was because we had substantial number of American voters of East European descent. And these happened to be in states like Pennsylvania and Illinois and some others that can be crucial and were crucial to the Democratic Party votes. So I think Clinton did it mainly for domestic political reasons. But I would add another thing. He was personally ensuring Russian President Yeltsin that the Partnership for Peace would be a substitute for NATO expansion, which Yeltsin approved. At the very same time, his ambassador in Warsaw was telling the Poles that it is a stepping stone to NATO membership, which in later it turned out to be. And let me add that later, the fact that the NATO, without a declaration of war and without a UN approval, made war against Serbia and set a precedent for what President Putin later did to Crimea, because we recognize the independence of Kosovo from Serbia without Serbia's approval. Now, one of the agreements that we had negotiated to end the Cold War, the Helsinki Final Act, prescribed that there should be no border changes without the approval of both countries. And of course, we did not have Serbian approval for that. We did not even have a referendum, simply a vote of the Kosovo parliament. Now, I would say that that provides a precise precedent for what President Putin later did to Crimea. And yet we have considered it virtuously a casus belli, although the United States, under several other occasions earlier, had recognized breakaway regions, South Sudan, and East Timor, and so on, when there were rebellions of people of a different necessity. We said that they had a right to secede. But the people of Crimea, who were about 80% Russian at least, and with hardly any Ukrainian speakers, clearly was exercising sort of the right of self-determination. We recognize that in other instances, but failed to in the case of Crimea. And as Russians said at the time, why is it that everybody else has a right to self-determination, but Russians don't?
Yeah.
I'm going ahead with some of your questions, but
No,
I think
I-
that is all tied in to what started in the 90s in the Clinton administration.
No, but yeah, it does remind me of something Kissinger said back in 1999, because it's interesting that in March of 1999 is both the month when NATO expanded for the first time, but also this 12 days later, also in March of 99, when NATO attacked Yugoslavia without this UN mandate. So it is quite, I think this was a breaking point, and this also when Kissinger said, well, now we can't tell the Russians anymore that it's simply a defensive alliance. So I think it's a good point. I wanted to ask you, based on your long experience with diplomacy with Moscow and assessing what happened since the 90s, what is it today's Western diplomats do not understand about Moscow and its security concerns?
Well, it seems to me that there has been an inability of our recent political leaders to put themselves in the shoes of other countries, that is, of other leaders. That was one of the things that I think both President Reagan and the first President Bush, they really wanted to understand where, like say, the Soviet leaders were coming from. What were they, what were they afraid of and not? And I would say in their diplomacy, as much as they and all of us condemned communism as a system, they did not publicly insult the Soviet leaders. On a personal level, they treated them with respect and began to listen to their point of view and began to understand that some of the things that we had feared were simply not true, even if they might have been at one time. That was that there was no plan really to invade Western Europe. We feared that, and that was the reason for NATO. On the other side, there was a real fear of what they were considered sort of aggressive signs from us. Now, when we started expanding NATO and then using it to make war illegally, as we did against first Serbia, and then later, most egregiously, we attacked Iraq, which had not threatened any NATO member. And we did so using fabricated evidence, which turned out to be a lie. And we did so massively. We attacked Iraq much more comprehensively and massively and without provocation, much more than I would say, the also criminal attack of Russia on Ukraine later. The fact is, President Putin had precedents for everything he did, which we now condemn. And these are things that, without the expansion of NATO, without the threat of military bases in territory that was once actually part of the Soviet Union, that would have been provocative to any of our countries. And yet we blithely go ahead and do that. And then now we say, Putin is a war criminal. Yes, he is. But so have been several of our presidents. And we set precedents for all of that. And our failure to understand that, and the failure particularly of the West Europeans to understand that, because they too have violated agreements which they made solemnly and simply ignored at times in ways that could only be interpreted as a threat to Russia. So we're in a tragic situation that there seems to be no real understanding on the part of those in power that what the roots of this violence are. And then let me also add this whole matter of economic sanctions. I think the United States and now Western Europe have grossly overused these. They have used what could have been, the basis of reasonable and fair international trade using the dollar. Instead, we've used that sort of predominance in the world financial system for political purposes, and I would say aggressive political purposes, because we began sanctioning Russia about things that had happened elsewhere and things that were happening within their sovereign authority. So it seems to me there has simply been a lack of, I would say, fair dealing. Of course, the current war in Ukraine is a tragedy, particularly for Ukraine. And the earlier solutions that could have been made, even if they required some change of territory, would have saved Ukraine much of its current destruction and hurt. That doesn't mean that any war is good. It is not. And the tragedy is that for the United States in particular, that we were strong enough and we were not threatened by anything but terrorism. We were not threatened by another country. And yet we tended to militarize our advantages. And I think this is subsequently going to rebound upon the best interests of the American public.
Yeah, well, there's you mentioned there's an inability to put ourselves in the shoes of Russia and indeed any other opponent as well, which is a very concerning development. But also with the Europeans, you said, especially the Europeans, and I get the same impression that the Europeans have become often a bit, well, not just more militant, more so, I think, now than the Americans, but in Europe, there's also this reluctance to even consider what Russian security might be. Indeed, they keep saying Ukraine needs security guarantees, but they more or less refuse to consider Russian security guarantees for Russia. Indeed, they don't even want to sit down and talk to Russia, even as this war is getting out of control. I was wondering, how do you explain this, collapse in diplomacy? Have you been consumed by ideology, or how do you make sense of this as a diplomat, seeing the
Well,
absence of diplomacy?
I can't make sense of it. I think what has happened, and what happened really cumulatively during this 21st century, was simply a demonization of the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. Now, he has done things that I would not like to see, happening in my country, which in fact are beginning to happen now, in terms of the violation of democratic procedures. However, these have been a reaction to these things that I've been talking about. And the idea now that if compromises are made regarding Ukraine, and that some of the Russian-speaking territories are transferred to Russia, inasmuch as the current Ukrainian government has virtually outlawed the Russian language, rather than protecting it, as earlier under the Soviet regime and the original independent Ukraine, these languages were both Russian and Ukrainian were official, and the minority languages were protected. Now, so what we see now is an allegation that, if we make a deal on Ukraine, he will go after the Baltic states or even Poland. There is zero evidence of that. And I think a lot of this goes back to the adoption of what was mistakenly called sort of a liberal world order. This was, to me, very similar to the Soviet attempt up until Gorbachev to create a socialist world order. So actually, the militarization of the peace after the end of the Cold War, I think, has been a problem, and we see in our media, in our governments, an attempt to demonize Vladimir Putin. Let's face it, the 90s were a catastrophic period for Russia. And as the old system broke down and there was no system, the area was totally crime-ridden and so on. And particularly elderly people, pensioners, sometimes they went without pay for 6 months or more. And they were told, oh, you're democratizing. Well, to most Russians, it didn't look like that. It looked like a few people had grabbed most of the assets. And inasmuch as this was being promoted by the United States and the West, it looked as if it was simply an attempt to colonize and dominate Russia. So later, we continued to first of all, deny Russian most favored nation treatment for trade when we had granted it to China easily, and we continued to sanction certain things over matters which happened within the internal jurisdiction of Russia, so that we were treating Russia as a pariah even when there was no real reason to. And I think part of this was the idea that somehow what we call our system, that is capitalism and what we call democracy, though we don't really define it very properly, it is going to sweep the world. And this reminds me of the Soviet communist idea that the world was destined to be communist, and that supporting that was simply supporting the forces of history. It turned out that this was not the end of history, as the famous book by Francis Fukuyama said. The whole idea that somehow the world is going to become culturally similar and united. It seems to me that there is nothing in history that provides any grounds for that, but it is a rationale for imperialism. And the idea that Europeans have that somehow our civilization is so superior to others, there is more than an element of racism there. And when they say, oh, it's terrible because this war in Ukraine is the first since the end of the Cold War in Europe. It's not. The first in Europe was NATO against Serbia. And second, why is a war in Europe worse than a war elsewhere? And where is the regard, for humanity? And we see now, while they are still trying to fuel a war in Ukraine, which is simply going to kill more Ukrainians along with Russians. At the same time, they are fueling a genocide in Gaza and increasingly in the West Bank. And at the same time, our people are talking about, we may get into a war with China. I think these are catastrophic ideas. My generation, I believe, my generation of political leaders and diplomats ended the Cold War in the interests of everybody. Since then, we have seen the forces, first of all, forces of the military-industrial complex, which is looking, for excuses to build more arms, and now increasingly to use them. I think that's catastrophic, and I think it is going to be to the disadvantage of the United States and the Europeans who are supporting this policy. Now, I'm hopeful that President Trump, with all of his unpredictability and changes, that at least he has made a step forward in recognizing that to end the war in Ukraine, there's going to have to be some territorial changes. And this is still going to be extraordinarily difficult. But the idea of the Europeans that they're going to increase their defense spending and so on at a time when internally they have increasing social problems and that so many other problems we're dealing with. It seems to me that they've totally lost a sense of direction. After all, what are we facing today? Every day we see more signs of the impact of climate change. And yet these wars and backtracking on many of the other efforts to reduce the warming gases in the air are simply going to naught. Meanwhile, failed states and war and famine are creating massive population movements that are straining all of our governments. And why we keep throwing weapons at this and killing people over issues that are simply not relevant to the security of our people in the West. And I think that now the reason our people are supporting what I think are mistaken policies is that our principal information, the media, at least in the United States and to some extent in Western Europe, have become purveyors of, I would say, a false ideology and are simply misrepresenting the facts of these things. Yes, every political leader who leads its country into a war which is not of direct defense of its territory is a war criminal. And all of our current leaders who are involved in this are that, and not just the president of Russia.
Well, Ambassador Matlock, on those wise words, we can leave it there. So thank you so much for your time. I know you're very busy. You travel a lot. We were just together in Georgia, so and you've been traveling even more since then. So I appreciate you taking the time, sir.
I'm glad to be with you. I wish I could be more optimistic.
Well, I share the sentiment. Thanks.
Well,